I had been driving through the desert for hours, the long road stretching out in front of me, disappearing into the horizon. The sky was glowing orange as the sun started to set. This was supposed to be just another part of my road trip, a way to clear my mind and get away from everything. I needed this trip. Life back home had become overwhelming. My job was draining, and I felt like I was just going through the motions every day. The road trip was my escape, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, away from the noise and expectations. I thought the desert would be calm and quiet, maybe a good place to sleep under the stars and find some peace. But all of that changed when the storm hit. It wasn't the kind of storm you could see coming, like when the sky gets dark and you hear thunder in the distance. This storm came out of nowhere, like it had suddenly erupted from nowhere, fierce and untamed. Lightning flashed across the sky and rain poured down so hard that I could barely see through my windshield. The road became slippery and I had no choice but to pull over. The storm was so wild, it felt like the whole world was trying to push me off the map. I lost track of time. I didn't know if I had been sitting there for minutes or hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel while the storm raged around me. My phone had no signal, and the idea of spending the night in my car, all alone in the dark, made me feel panicked. I needed to find shelter, somewhere safe to wait until the storm passed. Then, almost like a miracle, I saw it. Flickering lights in the distance, like a beacon in the middle of the storm. A motel. It seemed strange, a building all by itself in the middle of the desert, with a neon sign that said vacancy. It looked kind of eerie, like an old place that had seen better days. The kind of motel that was just barely holding on, forgotten by the world. I pulled into the parking lot, the rain still pounding on the roof, and hurried inside. A bell above the door chimed as I entered. The front desk receptionist looked up at me. The lobby was dimly lit, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges and a musty smell hanging in the air. He was an older man, with tired, sunken eyes and a smile that seemed more like a habit than anything real. He handed me a key on a brass keychain.
"Roommate,"
he said, his voice barely audible over the storm.
"Oh, and there's a phone in your room,"
he added, almost as an afterthought.
"If it rings, it's usually for emergencies. Make sure you answer it."
His eyes lingered on me for a moment, almost as if he was sizing me up, his gaze oddly intense. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wanted to say something else, but instead he just nodded, as if giving me some unspoken approval. There was a strange tension in the air, and something about his expression left me uneasy. I noticed his hand lingered on the key for a second too long, before finally letting it go. I thanked him quietly, taking the key and heading out through the main door into the storm, feeling his gaze on my back as I stepped outside to make my way to the room. I hurried through the rain and windy storm, my clothes quickly becoming soaked as I made my way to the room, which was thankfully close to the reception building. The door opened directly from the outside, the cold wind and rain following me in for a brief moment before I managed to close it. The room was small and simple, just a bed, a nightstand, and a window that rattled in the wind. I flipped the light switch, and the bulb flickered for a moment before staying on with a dim glow. The storm outside seemed to get even angrier, the wind howling violently. The power flickered and then went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I stood there for a moment, my eyes adjusting to the dark, feeling a heavy silence settle over the room. The pounding rain and distant thunder were the only sounds, and they seemed to echo, making the room feel even more isolated. I took a deep breath, but I felt an unease creeping, that sense that something was off, but I tried to push it aside. It was just the storm, just the strange circumstances of the day. I found a flashlight in the nightstand drawer and clicked it on, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. I set it on the nightstand, its light just enough to make me a bit more comfortable. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress creaking under my weight. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the wind battered against the window like it was trying to get in. I couldn't help but wonder why this place was here, out in the middle of nowhere, It felt too convenient, almost like it was waiting for me. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage on, hoping that sleep would come soon. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, unable to sleep with the storm raging outside, I heard it, a knock at the door. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the howling wind and the pounding rain. I sat up, my heart suddenly pounding. Who could be out there in this weather? I waited, listening for another sound, but there was nothing. But then it came again, 3 slow knocks, louder this time. I hesitated, my eyes fixed on the door. I got up slowly, the floor creaking beneath my feet as I made my way to the door. I paused for a moment, then took a deep breath and opened it. No one was there. I peered out into the rain, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the storm, but all I could see was the empty parking lot, the rain pouring down in sheets. I shivered, the cold wind biting at my skin. I closed the door, locking it, and shook my head. Maybe it was the receptionist trying to check on something. Either way, it left me feeling uneasy. The room felt even smaller now. The storm continued to batter the building. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it clung to me. I glanced at the flashlight, its beam flickering slightly, and I made a decision. I needed to get out of this room, if only for a little while. Maybe the reception area would feel less claustrophobic, and I could ask the receptionist what happened with the power. Maybe he had tried to check on me, or maybe there was some explanation for the knocks at the door. I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped back out into the storm. The rain pounded down on me as I made my way back to the reception building, my feet splashing through the puddles that had formed in the parking lot. The wind roared in my ears, and I felt a strange sense of urgency. The bell chimed again as I pushed open the door, and I stepped inside. The warmth of the room, a sharp contrast to the storm outside. The reception area was empty. The desk stood unattended, and the only sound was the ticking of an old clock on the wall, barely audible over the muffled storm. I stepped closer to the reception desk, shining my flashlight around, trying to see if there was any sign of the receptionist. Maybe he was in the back room or had stepped out for a moment. As I leaned over the counter to get a better look, I suddenly saw a dark silhouette of a man in the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat, and I jerked upright, the flashlight beam shaking slightly as I turned to face the figure. My pulse raced, but then the silhouette stepped forward into the dim light, revealing the familiar face of the receptionist.
Did I startle you?
He asked, his voice calm, almost amused. His tired eyes seemed to watch me closely, as if he was studying my reaction. I forced a smile, trying to play it cool. A little, I admitted, shrugging. I couldn't sleep with the storm, and then the power went out. I thought I'd come by and see what was going on. The receptionist nodded slowly, his expression unreadable.
The power's been acting up all night. Storms like this, they tend to cause all sorts of problems. It's not safe to be wandering around in this weather, you know.
His eyes seemed to narrow, almost as if he was testing my reaction. There was something in his voice, a strange undertone, that made me question if he was really concerned about my safety, or if he had another reason for wanting me to stay put. I nodded, trying to seem casual, though my heart was still racing from the sudden scare. Yeah, I guess I just needed to get out of that room for a bit. Thought maybe you'd have some news about the power, or... I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. Or maybe you were the one knocking at my door earlier? The receptionist's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of something, amusement or maybe annoyance. He shook his head.
No, that wasn't me. Must have been someone messing around.
I forced another smile, trying to act like it didn't bother me. Yeah, probably. The receptionist gestured towards a small seating area in the lobby, with a worn-out couch and a couple of armchairs. Why don't you sit for a while? His voice had an insistence to it, like he was trying too hard to sound casual. It felt less like a suggestion and more like an instruction, and it left me feeling unsettled. I glanced at the couch and nodded. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was better than being alone in that room right now. "Thanks," I said, moving towards it. I sank into the couch, the old cushions sagging under my weight. The receptionist watched me for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the back room, leaving me alone again. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The storm outside continued to rage, and I kept my flashlight close, the dim light a small comfort in the otherwise darkened room. A few minutes later, I heard the front door chime, and I looked up to see a man entering the lobby. He was slow, almost hesitant, and completely drenched from head to toe, his eyes wide with an expression somewhere between fear and confusion. He seemed lost, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was. He stopped a few feet away from me, his gaze darting around the lobby before settling on me. He leaned in slightly, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't be out here at this time." His eyes were almost pleading, as if trying to warn me about something. I blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" I asked, but before I could get a response, he took a step back, shaking his head. He leaned in closer. "Something is wrong here," he said, his eyes almost pleading with me to understand. Without another word, he turned abruptly and hurried back out into the storm, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. I sat there, the unease creeping back in full force. What did he mean by that? Why shouldn't I be here? I glanced towards the main door where the man had disappeared into the parking lot, but there was only darkness beyond. I tried to tell myself that it was just someone else rattled by the storm, but his words kept repeating in my mind, making it impossible to feel calm. As I sat in the lobby, trying to make sense of the man's warning, my eyes drifted to the window. The rain poured down, obscuring my view, but I thought I saw movement. Suddenly, the receptionist reappeared, stepping into the lobby from the back room. His eyes scanned the lobby as if he was looking for something. He looked at me, his expression unreadable.
"Has anyone been here while I was gone?"
He asked, his tone casual, but there was an intensity behind his eyes that made me uneasy. I hesitated, my mind flashing back to the strange man who had warned me. "No, no one," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady.
"All right, just checking."
The receptionist watched me for a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the back room, leaving me alone again. As I sat in the lobby, trying to make sense of the man's warning, my eyes drifted to the window. A man standing just outside watching. I tried to focus the weak beam of my flashlight, but the figure seemed to vanish as soon as the light touched it. I blinked, my pulse quickening. Was I seeing things? Or was there really someone out there? Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak. I turned to see the receptionist standing there, his eyes fixed on me, his expression unreadable.
"Did you see something?"
he asked, his voice strangely calm. My skin prickled with unease. I hesitated, swallowing hard. "I thought I saw someone outside," I admitted. The receptionist's eyes narrowed, and for a moment his expression darkened, as if he was annoyed. But then the smile returned, cold and empty.
"The storm can play tricks on you, especially out here, where there's nothing for miles."
He stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine.
"It's best if you stay inside. You wouldn't want to get lost out there."
His voice had a subtle edge to it, and I felt my unease grow into fear. There was something behind his words, something that made it clear this wasn't just about the storm. I nodded slowly, trying to seem compliant. "Yeah, you're probably right," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll just stay here." The receptionist watched me for another long moment, his gaze piercing, before finally turning away. He moved back towards the reception desk, but he didn't go into the back room this time. Instead, he stayed there, as if keeping an eye on me. Just then, the bell above the door chimed again, startling both of us. A woman entered, her raincoat dripping with water, her expression tense. She glanced at me, her eyes widening slightly as if she recognized me. She walked quickly to the counter, her voice low as she addressed the receptionist.
"I need a room,"
she said, but her eyes flickered to mine, and I could see something in her gaze, a warning or perhaps a plea for help. The receptionist frowned, seemingly annoyed by her sudden appearance, but handed her a key. As she turned to leave, she gave me a brief, meaningful look. Something told me she wasn't just another guest. Maybe she knew something about this place. I had to find a way to talk to her. She might be my only chance to understand what was going on. I waited until the receptionist turned his back, then made a decision. I stood up, moving towards the door. The receptionist glanced over at me, his eyes narrowing, but I forced a yawn and gestured vaguely towards the parking lot. He seemed to accept it, turning back to his paperwork without further comment. I stepped back outside. I hurried towards the woman's room, room 10, keeping my head low to avoid drawing attention. She was just unlocking her door when I reached her. She looked startled as I approached, but her eyes softened when she recognized me from the lobby. She gestured for me to come in, and I slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind me. The room was dimly lit, a single lamp casting a weak glow. The woman pulled off her raincoat, hanging it on the back of a chair, and turned to face me. Her expression was a mixture of fear and determination.
"You shouldn't be here,"
she whispered. She took a deep breath, glancing towards the door as if to make sure we weren't being overheard.
"I don't know exactly, but I've heard things that don't make sense. People come here, and they never leave the same. I don't think this place is real, not entirely. It's like it exists somewhere between worlds, and it keeps us here for a reason."
Her voice was shaky, her eyes wide with fear. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" She shook her head.
"I mean, I've tried to leave before. No matter what I do, I always end up back here. And the storm, it's not a normal storm. It's part of it, keeping us trapped."
She paused, her voice trembling.
"The receptionist. He isn't just an employee here. He's more like a gatekeeper. He knows who comes and goes, and I think he controls it somehow. He watches us, making sure we don't figure things out."
My stomach twisted and I felt a surge of panic. "How do we get out?" The woman hesitated, then reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook. She flipped through its pages, revealing hastily scribbled notes, diagrams, and strange symbols.
"I've been trying to figure it out,"
she said, her finger pointing to a drawing that resembled a map.
"There's a pattern to this place. Something about the storm and the power lines. I think if we leave at the right moment, when the storm breaks, we might be able to slip through. But we have to be quick. Tonight, while the storm is at its peak, might be our only chance."
I nodded, the fear in my chest replaced by a glimmer of hope. "All right," I said. "Let's do it." The woman gave me a small, determined smile.
"We'll leave in an hour. Be ready."
She paused, her eyes locking onto mine.
"And whatever you do, don't let him see you. If he suspects we're trying to leave."
She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood. If the receptionist knew, we'd never make it out of here alive. I slipped back out of her room and made my way back to my own room. As soon as I got inside, the phone on the nightstand rang. The sound cut through the pounding rain outside, startling me. I froze, staring at the phone. The receptionist's words echoed in my mind. "If it rings, it's usually for emergencies. Make sure you answer it." My heart pounded as I approached the phone, my hand hovering above the receiver. Finally, I picked it up. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. There was silence on the other end, followed by faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. I strained to listen, my pulse quickening. Then, I heard a familiar voice, cold, calm, unmistakable.
You shouldn't have talked to her.
It was the receptionist. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if it were responding to my fear. Then I heard them. Voices outside my door, multiple voices, all urging me to leave. Among them, I recognized the woman's voice and the strange man's voice, both pleading,
We're trying to help you.
He's keeping you trapped. My heart raced as I stood frozen, the phone still in my hand. Then, I heard another voice, fainter but distinct. It was the receptionist, coming from the phone.
Do not open the door. They can't enter unless you let them in.
I felt my pulse quicken, realization dawning. The entities outside had taken on the voices of those I had met trying to lure me out. Maybe, just maybe, the receptionist was trying to protect me from something far worse, something waiting just beyond the door. The receptionist's voice came again, more urgent this time, as if he could sense my hesitation.
Listen to me. Do not respond to them. They will try everything to make you open that door. You must ignore them.
I swallowed hard, trying to focus on his words as the voices outside grew louder. The storm raged on, and I could feel the pressure mounting in my head, fear gnawing at my resolve.
When you don't hear them anymore,
the receptionist continued, his voice steady and commanding.
Leave the room and come to the reception area as fast as you can. Don't stop for anything. I'll make sure it's safe. Trust me, it's your only chance.
The voices outside continued to grow louder, shifting from pleading to angry demands. They pounded on the door, their voices becoming a cacophony of desperation and rage. I clutched the phone, every instinct screaming at me to do something, anything. But I remembered the receptionist's words, "Do not respond." I closed my eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to block out the chaos. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually the voices began to fade, replaced only by the relentless storm outside. I opened my eyes, the silence more unnerving than the noise. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew this was the moment I had to move. I set the phone down, grabbed the flashlight, and approached the door. My hand trembled as I unlocked it, pulling it open just enough to peer outside. The parking lot was empty, the rain still pouring down in sheets. I took a deep breath and stepped out, my feet splashing through the puddles as I ran towards the reception area. The storm seemed to push against me, the wind trying to force me back. I heard a scraping noise behind me, almost like claws dragging across the concrete, but I resisted the urge to look back. My focus was on the light of the reception door, my only hope of safety. Just as I reached the entrance, the door swung open and the receptionist was there, his eyes wide with urgency. He pulled me inside, slamming the door shut behind us.
They're getting stronger,
he muttered. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine.
You need to understand, this place is a barrier and I'm trying to keep them out.
He gestured towards the salt lines along the door frame and strange symbols etched into the walls.
These are protections, but they're not foolproof. Whatever is out there, it wants in, and it's getting harder to keep them back.
I swallowed hard, my mind racing. What are they? The receptionist shook his head.
Not entirely sure. Entities, something that feeds on fear and confusion. They can take on the voices of those you trust, trick you into letting them in. That's why you can't listen to them.
He paused, his expression grim.
They want you because you're vulnerable right now, caught between decisions. The storm, the motel, it's all part of keeping them at bay, but they know when someone is on the edge, and they exploit it.
I felt a chill run through me, the weight of his words settling in. So what do we do now? I asked. The receptionist looked towards the window, the storm still raging outside.
We wait until morning, when they're weaker. We stay here, keep the lights on, and don't let them in.
He turned back to me, his eyes filled with a strange mix of determination and exhaustion.
You're safe for now, but you need to trust me. If you don't, none of us are getting out of here alive.
I hesitated, my mind racing. The fear was still there, gnawing at me. I had to tell him. I went into her room, I said. The woman in room 10. She told me things about this place, about you. Why didn't she harm me? The receptionist's eyes narrowed slightly, a shadow of frustration crossing his face. He let out a slow breath.
She didn't harm you because she couldn't, not directly,
he explained, his voice measured.
The entities, they feed on your fears, on your doubts. She wanted you to choose to trust her over me. If she could have convinced you, you would have willingly let them inside your room.
I frowned, my heart pounding. So she's one of them? The receptionist nodded.
Not entirely, not yet. She's been here too long, and they've started to change her. She's like an in-between, a pawn they use to lure others. She still looks human, but she's already lost a part of herself.
He glanced at the door, the tension in his shoulders evident.
They're using her to play on your emotions, to make you question what's real. That's why you're still alive, because you didn't fully trust her. You've listened to me.
I shivered, the weight of the situation sinking in deeper. So what now? The receptionist looked at me, his eyes hard.
Now we wait, and if you hear anything at all, you ignore it. Morning is our only chance, and remember, you need to stay strong. They're looking for any weakness.
Suddenly, there was a loud noise from the back room, a clattering crash, as if something heavy had fallen. The receptionist's eyes widened, and his expression shifted from calm determination to something closer to fear. He turned towards the door marked "Employees Only."
Stay here,
he said, his voice tense.
I have to check on something. Don't leave this room no matter what.
Without waiting for a response, he disappeared into the back, the door clicking shut behind him. I stood there, my heart pounding, the uneasy silence filling the space left by his absence. The storm outside raged, the wind howling against the building, and the sense of isolation pressed down on me. Moments after the door closed, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I felt a chill that wasn't just from the storm. It was something deeper, something wrong. The whispers started again, faint but growing louder. I gripped the flashlight, the beam flickering slightly as I pointed it towards the front door. The rattling began, soft at first, then more insistent, as if someone or something was trying to force its way in, but I couldn't see anything through the glass door. Suddenly, I heard the receptionist's voice from the back room. It sounded strained, desperate.
Help me!
He shouted, his voice muffled by the thick door. My heart skipped a beat. Something felt wrong. The plea was real, but the tone, it wasn't right. Fear twisted in my chest. Should I help him? Should I stay put? The voices outside were getting louder, blending with the receptionist's shouts from the back. I felt the weight of indecision crushing me. Then the door to the back room creaked open, and the receptionist stepped out. He looked the same, but something about him was off. His eyes seemed darker, his movements too jerky, almost forced. He gave me a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes.
Everything is under control now,
he said. He gestured towards the worn-out couch. You should get some rest. Morning isn't far off. A cold dread settled in my stomach. The salt lines along the door were disturbed, smeared as if someone had deliberately broken them. My gut twisted with fear, a silent alarm echoing in my mind. Was this really the same receptionist, or had something else taken his place? I forced a nod, moving slowly towards the couch, every nerve in my body on edge. I sat down, keeping my eyes on him as he moved towards the front door, his back to me. I had to decide, was he still the person who had tried to protect me, or had the entities found a way inside? The storm continued to rage outside, but the real danger felt like it was now within these walls. I watched the receptionist carefully, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. Each flicker seemed to twist his features, his face shifting in unnatural ways, and when the lights came back on fully, his face had twisted into an unsettling grin. The front doorbell chimed, then slowly swung open on its own, letting in a blast of cold air and rain. My eyes widened as I saw them, some sort of figures, vague and inhuman, moving towards the entrance. Their forms seemed to blur and shift, as if they were barely holding on to this reality. A chorus of whispers filled the air, echoing in my ears, and I realized they were coming from the receptionist. He started speaking, but the voice that came out was no longer his own. It was a cacophony of voices, all familiar, all wrong. The woman's voice, the strange man's voice, the whispers. They all spoke through him, overlapping in a distorted, chilling harmony. Panic seized me as I realized too late that whatever stood before me was no longer the man I had met earlier. The flickering lights cast strange shadows across the walls, making the entities seem closer, their distorted forms creeping forward. The receptionist's grin grew wider, unnatural, and his eyes turned black, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light. Suddenly, the figures from outside began to enter the lobby, their forms gliding across the floor, leaving a chill in their wake. The receptionist, or whatever he had become, lunged at me, his movements jerky and erratic, grabbing me by the neck. His grip was cold, like death itself. I tried to scream, but the world around me began to fade, the whispers growing louder, drowning out everything else until everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the cold floor of what looked like the motel lobby. But it was morning, and something was different. The room was in ruins, the walls cracked and covered in grime, the furniture broken and covered in dust. The air was thick with a musty smell, and a chill ran through me as I pushed myself to my feet, trying to understand where I was. I looked around, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken windows. It slowly dawned on me that I was still at the motel, but it looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. My heart pounded as I stumbled towards the exit, desperate to leave this nightmare behind. I pushed open the front door and stepped outside. The storm had cleared, leaving only a heavy stillness in the air. The parking lot was empty, my car still there, covered in dirt and debris as if it had been sitting there for years. I climbed inside, my hands trembling as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life and I pulled out of the parking lot, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. As I drove away, I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror one last time. The motel stood there, broken and desolate, but something else caught my eyes, some strange markings on my neck. Realizing that the events of last night might have been true, I turned my eyes back to the road, my hands gripping the wheel. I didn't look back again. I drove until the motel disappeared from my view, vowing never to return to roads like this again. Months later, I found myself sitting in a quiet library, the memory of that night still gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't let it go. The strange motel, the storm, the receptionist. I needed answers. I searched through old records, articles, anything that could tell me what had happened. And then, I found it. An old newspaper clipping dated 10 years ago. The headline read, "Desert Motel Closed After Series of Paranormal Events." The article described strange occurrences at the motel, reports of eerie figures appearing during storms, and claims of hearing voices that weren't there. During a particularly fierce storm, the event that ultimately led to the motel's closure occurred. The receptionist allegedly encountered strange, inexplicable events, but no one believed him. A few days later, he vanished without a trace, and the owners decided to close the motel for good. A chill ran through me as I read the details. Everything matched. The storm, the voices, the abandoned state of the building. The article ended with a quote from a local resident. "That place isn't just haunted, it's a gateway. Once you're there, you're lucky if you ever make it out." I closed the book, my hands trembling. I had escaped, but I knew that whatever haunted that motel was still out there, waiting for the next person to wander in off the lonely desert road.